What if a small-town teacher vanished without a trace, and no one bothered to ask why? What if the silence around her wasn't just forgetfulness, but fear? This is not just a mystery, it's a reckoning. A decades-old disappearance in rural Vermont left behind only whispers, locked rooms, and a classroom frozen in time. But 25 years later, a letter hidden in the walls of an abandoned school would reignite the questions no one dared ask. Who was Grace Whitmore? Why did she leave? And why did she come back, only to disappear forever? In this haunting, true-inspired story, you'll follow her sister Lydia's journey through secrets buried by guilt, a town desperate to maintain appearances, and one woman's quiet fight to finally be heard. A story of echoes, forgiveness, and the weight of truth that refuses to stay buried. This is the story of the teacher who vanished, and the legacy that would not die. Welcome to Nest Soul, where forgotten stories are finally brought into the light. The days following Grace Whitmore's disappearance fell over Maplewood Hollow like a long shadow, stretching across the town's peaceful facade and into the corners where secrets usually lay undisturbed. What began as concern quickly evolved into obsession. The community, once so tightly knit and comfortable in its routines, now stirred with quiet dread, their morning greetings laced with suspicion and their Sunday prayers heavier with fear. St. Mary's Elementary felt different, colder somehow, as if the warmth that Grace carried with her had been extinguished. The third-grade classroom, room 3B, stood locked and untouched, the chalkboard still bearing the words, "Autumn leaves are falling," in her looping script. Mr. Howard Ellis, who had worked at the school for over 3 decades, refused to clean the room, telling Principal Harris that Grace might still come back and would want to find everything as she left it. "Call it foolish," he muttered, his arthritic hands gripping his mop. "But I know what I saw in her eyes that day. She wasn't running away. She was saying goodbye." Meanwhile, Lydia grew more withdrawn. The town's pity didn't comfort her. It infuriated her. At the diner, where whispers hovered like steam above coffee mugs, she heard the theories. "Maybe she was depressed," someone said. "I heard she was pregnant," another added, always in a hushed tone, as though the shame was too heavy to say aloud. Lydia, sitting 2 booths away, clutched her cup with trembling fingers. She knew her sister better than anyone. Grace had always been composed, strong-willed, even when their parents died. There was nothing unstable about her, unless heartbreak could be called madness. And perhaps it could, Lydia thought, as she walked alone through the woods behind the spot where Grace's Vespa was found. No sign, no scarf snagged on branches, no torn pages from a notebook, just silence. Absolute, maddening silence. The police had done their best, but they lacked the resources and resolve. Sheriff Warren's final report listed the case as a missing person. Voluntary disappearance suspected. Lydia had stared at those words for hours, tears falling not from grief, but from fury. How easy it was to erase a woman's life with bureaucratic ink. But one person hadn't moved on. Reverend Joseph Carter. He was in his 70s, worn and thoughtful, with hands always stained in blue ink from decades of sermon writing. He remembered the 3 times Grace had come to the church that month. Not to confess, Grace had never liked confession, but to ask questions. Deep questions. What does it mean to do something right that hurts others? If a person vanishes to save herself, is that a sin? He had sensed something, a plea hidden beneath her measured tone, and he had given her what little comfort he could. God understands the burden of silence, he told her. But now, in his study, that conversation haunted him. Should he have asked more? Should he have pressed her to tell him what was wrong? Guilt crept into his prayers, and while others tried to forget, he began combing through his notes, searching for patterns, for meaning, for any trace of what she had tried to say between the lines. Meanwhile, Dr. Charles Benning, Maplewood's beloved physician, grew strangely quiet. He had been vocal during the early days, supporting the search, comforting parents, insisting that Grace had always seemed a little fragile and prone to romanticizing things. But as time passed, he faded from public view. People chalked it up to age, to fatigue, to sorrow. No one thought to question his silence, but Lydia did. Because once, a year before Grace vanished, she had seen something, barely more than a glance, a flicker between the doctor and her sister outside the general store, a look exchanged, a hand that lingered too long. And afterward, Grace hadn't spoken of it, but she had started walking home a different way, avoiding Church Street altogether. Now, with Grace gone, that single moment festered in Lydia's memory, and she wondered who else had seen, who else had known and said nothing. The town held a memorial that November, more to ease its own conscience than to honor the missing. Reverend Carter spoke of Grace's contributions, her light, her compassion. Children laid sunflowers on the steps of the school. A plaque was mounted on a bench near the library, in loving memory of Grace Whitmore, who taught us more than books ever could. But Lydia didn't attend. She sat by the river alone, holding the last birthday card Grace had ever written her, rereading the careful handwriting, the words now blurred by grief. She didn't want memorials. She wanted answers. And yet, none came. Years passed, decades even. Room 3B was reopened, eventually repainted and reassigned. New teachers came and went. Grace became a story, a cautionary tale told at sleepovers. "Don't walk alone in the woods," children whispered. Grace Whitmore did, and she never came back. Lydia moved to Montpelier after her husband died, but she never stopped returning on October 15th, placing sunflowers by the old trailhead where Grace's Vespa had once been found. Each year she asked the same question to the air: "Why didn't you tell me?" And each year the trees answered with nothing but wind. It wasn't until the summer of 1997 that anything changed. St. Mary's Elementary had fallen into disrepair. Crumbling stone, rusted plumbing, a leaky roof. The town council voted to renovate, hoping to preserve what they could. Demolition began quietly in August. Workers tore up tiles, replaced old wiring, fixed ancient heating ducts. And then one morning, in the dark corner of the school's semi-basement, a foreman named Frank Malley knocked on a wall that didn't sound right. "It's hollow," he muttered, frowning. According to the blueprints, there should have been solid stone. But this section? Too thin. Too new. He fetched a hammer, gave the wall a hard strike, and the plaster cracked. Dust spilled out. Behind the false wall was a cavity, a narrow, hidden room, untouched for decades. And inside, buried under cobwebs and rusted nails, was a metal box. On top of it, resting like it had been placed with care, was a letter in a yellowed envelope, its handwriting delicate and unmistakable. "To whoever finds this." No one in the construction crew knew what they'd uncovered. Not yet. But the moment they brought it to the principal's office, the principal called the police. Within the hour, the phone rang in Lydia Whitmore's apartment in Montpelier. And as she dropped the receiver in disbelief, one truth rang louder than all the others. After 25 years of silence, Grace Whitmore was about to speak again. Dot. The drive from Montpelier to Maplewood Hollow had never felt longer, though Lydia Whitmore had made that trip more times than she could count. But this time was different. The road curled through valleys bathed in the gold of late October, the kind of autumn Grace had always loved, but Lydia hardly noticed the scenery. Her mind raced, repeating the words the mayor had spoken on the phone. "We found something. An old letter. We think it might be hers." By the time she pulled into town, her hands were trembling so badly she could barely park the car. Outside the old stone schoolhouse, a small crowd had gathered. Familiar faces, older, grayer, but unmistakable, stood silently, exchanging uneasy glances. And there, leaning on a cane, stood Howard Ellis. His eyes lit up when he saw her, but they were filled with something else too, a knowing sadness. "Lydia," he rasped, I told them all. She said there was a letter." Lydia moved toward him, voice barely a whisper. "You remember that?" "Clear as the day she left," he said, tears rising. "I should have said something. I should have insisted." But Lydia had no time for regret. Inside the school, the atmosphere was thick with solemnity. Sheriff Tom Riggs, who'd taken over the department years ago, met her at the door. "Miss Whitmore," he said with measured respect, holding a clear evidence bag containing a yellowed envelope. "By law, we have to open this in your presence. The handwriting, well, everyone believes it's your sister's." Lydia stared at the envelope. The handwriting was unmistakable. That delicate script, neat and feminine, with a gentle loop in every Y, Grace's mark. For a moment, Lydia couldn't breathe. It was as if time had folded in on itself. She was no longer a grieving woman of 52, but the younger sister of a missing teacher, frozen in the same grief that had never truly loosened its grip. In the teacher's lounge, unchanged except for new linoleum and fluorescent lights, Lydia sat with the sheriff, the mayor, the current principal, and Mr. Ellis, who insisted on being there. The room fell quiet as Sheriff Riggs slid the letter from its envelope and began to read. To my dear town, to those I loved and to those who loved me, if you're reading this, then the truth has finally found a voice. My name is Grace Whitmore, and I was, your teacher, your friend, your sister. I wrote this letter on the afternoon of October 15th, 1972. That evening, I intended to leave Maplewood Hollow forever. Lydia gasped softly. Mr. Ellis clenched his eyes shut. Riggs continued, his voice steady. I was not abducted. I was not lost. I did not take my own life. I made a decision, a painful one, to disappear, because I was carrying a child. Murmurs rippled through the room. Lydia pressed her fingers to her lips, eyes wide with shock, though some part of her had known, or at least feared. The letter went on. The father of my child is a man this town knows well, a man who cannot publicly acknowledge our child without destroying the life he built. He asked me to go, and I agreed. Not because I was weak, but because I loved my child enough to protect him from the shame this town would surely place on us. I packed what little I could. I had a name prepared, Grace Walker, a new life waiting in Washington, D.C., as a war widow with no past and only a future for my son. Lydia's tears finally came, hot and heavy. The grief she'd buried for decades burst through like floodwaters. She couldn't speak, couldn't move. Sheriff Riggs hesitated. There's more. And the room stilled again. The name of the father is... He paused, eyes narrowing as he read. Dr. Charles Benning. A collective gasp cut through the air. Lydia stood up so abruptly her chair screeched backward. Benning? She choked. But he always said... He told us she was unstable, Mr. Ellis growled. Said she might have lost her mind. The sheriff continued. Grace wrote. Charles knew of the pregnancy. It was he who suggested I vanish. He gave me money. He said he would spread the idea I had gone mad, that it was better than letting the truth ruin everything. Lydia could barely stand. Her legs buckled, and she had to grip the table. Everything she'd believed, every suspicion, every instinct was true. Grace hadn't been weak. She had been betrayed. And then, just as the weight of the revelation began to settle, the door creaked open. A voice spoke, calm but trembling. I heard you found the letter. All eyes turned. There, framed in the doorway, stood Dr. Charles Benning, or what remained of him. At 80 years old, he was stooped, his once pristine white hair now thin and disheveled. But the eyes were the same, piercing, intelligent, weary. I suppose, he said, stepping into the room, it's time to tell the rest of it. Sheriff Riggs stood. Dr. Benning, this is an official matter. I'm going to have to ask. Let him speak, Lydia interrupted, voice shaking with rage. Let him explain why he let my sister die. The room froze. Dr. Benning didn't deny it. He didn't try to justify. Instead, he walked slowly to the center of the room, took the seat Grace had once used to grade papers, and looked around. She didn't leave that night, he said. Grace never made it out of Maplewood Hollow. The silence in the teacher's lounge grew dense and suffocating as Dr. Charles Benning sat hunched forward, hands clasped, eyes fixed on some invisible point between the floor and the past. Lydia couldn't look away from him, her entire body stiff with fury and disbelief. But her voice had abandoned her, lodged somewhere between her heartbreak and the truth she had waited 25 years to hear. Sheriff Riggs finally broke the tension, voice clipped but steady. Dr. Benning, you need to understand that anything you say now can be used against you. The old man smiled bitterly, a dry, brittle smile devoid of defense. What more can you take from me, Sheriff? Time already took everything. He turned toward Lydia, his voice hollow. Grace was pregnant. That part is true. The child was mine. But I never intended to honor that. I was afraid, terrified, in fact. I had a wife, a reputation, a practice, a church pew with my name on it. Grace wanted to keep the baby. She wanted me to tell the truth. She believed the town would forgive us. I knew better. His voice cracked, years of pretense unraveling. I told her to leave. I begged her to disappear. I gave her money, told her she'd never be safe here. But she changed her mind. That Monday, she came to my office, said she wasn't going through with it. She said she'd tell everyone, about the baby, about me. She gave me until morning to come clean myself, or she would do it for me. His hands trembled now. She wasn't angry, just resolved. She said the child had the right to exist without shame, that if I couldn't be brave, she would be for both of us. Lydia swallowed hard, the room blurring around her. "So you killed her," she said flatly, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. "Not with a weapon," he whispered, "but with cowardice, yes. We fought. I said awful things. I told her the child might not even be mine. I called her selfish. I said she was destroying my family. She ran out, sobbing, and I let her go." His breath hitched. "I followed her in my car, hoping to stop her. She took that winding road into the hills, the one she loved, the one with the old wooden bridge. It was raining. She was crying. I could see her Vespa weaving slightly, too fast for those slick roads." His eyes grew distant, like he was no longer speaking to them, but confessing to the ghosts only he could see. "She lost control on a curve. The bike skidded. She wasn't wearing her helmet. Her body hit the rocks before I could reach her. Her neck." His voice broke. "She died instantly." No one spoke. No one moved. The only sound was the wind moaning softly against the old window frames. "I panicked," he continued after a pause. "I knew if I called the police, the truth would come out. About us. About the baby. I had everything to lose, so I did the unthinkable. I put her in my car, drove to the old mining shaft out past Clearwater Bend, the one they filled when they built the dam in the 80s. It was still open then, still deep enough to swallow anything. I said a prayer. I told myself I was giving her peace. But really, I was giving myself time. Time to lie, to bury my sins where no one could find them." Mr. Ellis's cane fell from his hand with a loud clatter, but he didn't bend to retrieve it. His face was pale, jaw clenched. "You let us search for her. Let us pray and cry and search every damn field in this town while she was lying dead beneath the water. How dare you?" Dr. Benning nodded slowly, accepting the rage. "I've lived with it every day. I saw her face in every patient. Heard her voice in the halls of this school. The guilt didn't fade. It grew. When the letter surfaced, I knew it was time. I had no right to keep hiding." Sheriff Riggs stood, pulled his radio, and calmly requested backup and legal personnel. "Dr. Benning, I'm placing you under arrest for obstruction of justice, abuse of a corpse, and withholding evidence in a death investigation, pending further charges upon forensic confirmation." The old man didn't resist. "Good," he said quietly. "She deserves the truth, even if it comes from a coward." As officers escorted him out, the crowd outside the school shifted like a field of wheat under wind. Whispers rising, eyes wide, heads turning. Lydia remained frozen. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. The weight of it was too much for emotion. Her sister had never left. She had been taken. Not by strangers or chance or mystery, but by shame, by silence, and by the man who feared truth more than death. Later that evening, Lydia stood by the shoreline of the lake above the buried mining shaft. The setting sun painted the water in hues of fire and blood. She dropped to her knees and whispered Grace's name into the wind, hoping it might travel through time, through earth and water, to reach whatever remained of the girl who once believed in kindness more than cruelty. "I'm here now," she whispered. "I know everything." And for the first time in 25 years, the wind whispered back. News of Dr. Charles Benning's confession shattered the brittle quiet that had settled over Maplewood Hollow for a quarter of a century. What had once been whispered at dinner tables or speculated in half-finished sentences now rang through the town like the final toll of the church bell after a funeral, clear, loud, undeniable. The local papers picked up the story first, then regional channels followed, and within days, reporters began circling the small Vermont town like vultures around a long-hidden carcass. "Grace Whitmore case reopened after 25 years," the headlines read, and beneath them, grainy photos of Grace in her classroom, smiling beside her students, circulated like relics of a ghost whose story had been rewritten by death. Lydia avoided the cameras. She declined every interview request. She stayed inside her childhood home, the one she had never brought herself to sell, and waited. It had always been about waiting. Waiting for answers. Waiting for closure. And now, waiting for her sister to finally be brought home. Sheriff Riggs moved quickly. The confession was enough to secure a court order and mobilize a specialized search team. The old mining shaft, now submerged beneath the reservoir created by the Clearwater Dam in the mid-1980s, became the center of an operation that drew in dive teams, sonar experts, and even a geologist brought in from out of state to determine the shaft's stability. No one had any illusions. They weren't searching for a miracle. They were searching for bones. And on the third day, they found them. It began with a glint of rust, metal debris from a Vespa frame, tangled in weeds 60 feet below the surface. Then came fragments of fabric, faded and threadbare, followed by the unmistakable shape of a human jaw. The remains were removed with care, reverence, and silence. No press were allowed. No photos were leaked. Lydia stood on the shoreline that morning, wrapped in a gray wool coat that had once belonged to Grace, watching the divers emerge one by one. She didn't ask questions. She didn't have to. The ache in her chest told her all she needed to know. Sheriff Riggs approached, his face pale but composed. "We'll have the DNA results soon," he said. "But, Lydia, it's her. It's Grace." She nodded once, lips trembling but refusing to fall apart. "Thank you," she said. "Bring her home." A week later, a quiet funeral was held at St. Mary's Church, the very place where Grace had once taught children to sing Christmas hymns, and had sat asking questions no one had answered in time. It was a cold, sunlit day, and the pews were filled, not just with those who had loved her, but with those who had once dismissed her, judged her, forgotten her. Former students now grown stood beside their children. Parents brought flowers. Reverend Joseph Carter, now in his 90s and leaning heavily on a cane, delivered the eulogy with tears in his eyes. "She asked me once," he said, voice cracking, "if God could forgive a person who did what they had to do to survive. I didn't have the right answer back then, but I do now." Grace Whitmore did not run away. She didn't vanish. She lived bravely in a world that demanded she hide. She loved more deeply than most of us could ever understand, and she was failed by the very people who should have protected her. When the service ended, a long line formed by her casket. Simple, white, adorned with yellow sunflowers. Lydia stood nearby, accepting soft condolences, empty apologies, and the quiet gratitude of those who had realized too late what Grace had meant. That night, back at the house, Lydia sat alone in the room that had once belonged to her sister. She opened the drawer of the old writing desk, unsure of what she was looking for. What she found was a small tin box tucked beneath a false bottom. Inside were pages of poetry. Grace's handwriting, delicate as ever, filled with longing, sadness, and a strange kind of hope. One poem, dated just 2 weeks before her death, read, "If I go, do not say I was lost. Say instead I chose the wind, the trees, the silence between what was and what must be. And though I did not leave a trail, I left my name in the roots and my heart in the hands of the child I would have loved." Lydia pressed the pages to her chest and wept, not just for the years stolen, but for the life that Grace had dreamed of and never lived. Later that month, the Maplewood School Board voted unanimously to rename St. Mary's Elementary. It would now be called the Grace Whitmore Academy. A marble plaque was placed at the entrance, and Room 3B was transformed into a reading room and memorial filled with children's books, student artwork, and a framed photograph of Grace with her third-grade class in 1971. The room smelled faintly of sunflowers and chalk, and though it was quiet, it did not feel empty. Mr. Ellis, now retired, visited often. He told the children, "Every time you open a book, you're helping Miss Grace finish the lesson she started." In the months that followed, life in Maplewood Hollow slowly returned to its pace, gentler, more honest, more aware. But the town had changed, and Grace's story had changed it. And in that change, perhaps, there was redemption. For Lydia, healing came not from justice, but from truth. She returned to the hillside above the old shaft one final time in spring. The lake shimmered beneath her, birdsong fluttering in the trees. She scattered wildflower seeds across the slope, whispering her sister's name with each handful. "You're not beneath water anymore," she murmured. "You're everywhere now." And in that breeze, in the hush between the trees, it felt like Grace was finally freed. 6 months had passed since Grace Whitmore's remains had been pulled from the depths of Clearwater Reservoir. And though Maplewood Hollow had returned to its rhythm, children biking through puddles, church bells ringing each Sunday morning, and pies cooling on windowsills, there was something subtly different in the way people moved, the way they spoke her name. It no longer carried the weight of mystery or gossip. It carried reverence. Grace was no longer the missing teacher. She was the woman who had loved too quietly, suffered too deeply, and been buried too long beneath silence and fear. But in the quiet corners of the town, her presence was more palpable than ever. Mr. Ellis, now well into his 80s and walking with the help of a wheeled frame, continued to visit the Grace Whitmore Academy every morning before the students arrived. He would sit by the classroom-turned-reading room, room 3B, and talk to her, or at least to her photo, hung above the blackboard. "Still keeping them in line, I hope?" he'd mutter with a smile, eyes glistening. And in those moments, surrounded by books and sunlight, it almost felt like she was listening. The town had changed in subtle, permanent ways. There were new policies in the school for teachers who needed support, mandatory reporting for rumors or signs of distress, and a scholarship established in Grace's name for aspiring educators from small towns. Lydia, though still fragile from the weight of truth, had found new purpose. She began volunteering at the school twice a week, reading to children who were too young to know what had happened, but were being taught to remember her not through tragedy, but through kindness. They called her Miss Lydia, and she smiled at how strange it felt to be addressed the way her sister had once been. But one afternoon, in early April, something unexpected arrived that shook Lydia in a way she hadn't anticipated. A reporter named Megan Hart from a Boston magazine reached out, not for a sensational piece, not for a retrospective on the tragedy, but for help. She had been doing research on women who disappeared in the 1970s and had stumbled upon Grace's case. "There's a detail in your sister's letter," she said over the phone. "She said she had a new identity prepared, Grace Walker, and she was headed to Washington, D.C. We know she never made it, but something's bothering me. I found record of a woman named Grace Walker working as a nanny in D.C. from 1972 to 1995. Same name. Same age, but it's not your sister." Lydia froze. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying someone else lived the life your sister intended. Maybe coincidentally, maybe not." But it got me wondering, how many women in that time chose silence over shame? How many disappeared willingly because there wasn't a place for them to stay? The question haunted Lydia for days. She thought of Grace sitting in the church, asking Reverend Carter about right and wrong. She thought of her trembling hands the last morning she left, the look on her face that Lydia would never forget. She had tried to leave, to protect her child, to escape a town that wouldn't protect her. But the world had been too small for women like her. The town had failed her. The man she loved had betrayed her. And silence had killed her long before the rocks had. That week, Lydia found herself back in the archives. Newspapers, hospital records, adoption agencies. She didn't know what she was searching for. Proof of the child, a name, a face, something to prove Grace's love hadn't died with her. But she found nothing. No birth certificate, no anonymous adoption trail, nothing to indicate the child had survived. Had the baby died with her? Or had Benning lied about that too? The lack of answers burned deeper than the answers ever had. So, Lydia did what Grace might have done. She wrote a long letter, not to the public, not to the press, but to the child, wherever he or she might be or might have been. She published it in the Maplewood Times. It read, "To the one she carried, if you ever existed, know this. You were loved, fiercely, bravely. She gave everything to protect you, and though the world silenced her, it could not erase her. You were never a mistake. You were her reason, and she was the best of all of us." The letter was reprinted in regional papers and later picked up by a national outlet covering stories of women erased by time. And from that letter came something Lydia never expected. Letters, emails, dozens of them, from women who had known Grace, from former students who still remembered the way she taught them to believe in themselves, from mothers who had once been afraid to speak up. Grace's story had given them language. Her truth had given them courage. In the end, she had not simply been found. She had been heard. Lydia placed the last of the wildflowers along the edge of Clearwater Reservoir that spring. She no longer cried when she visited the spot. Instead, she sat and spoke softly, sharing updates as if Grace were just on the other side of the breeze. "They remember you now," she said once, tracing her fingers along a smooth stone, "not because of how you died, but because of how you lived." And in the hush that followed, as the trees swayed gently and the sunlight danced across the water, it felt, for just a moment, as though the air had exhaled, as though Grace Whitmore, once lost, had finally come home. In the years that followed Grace Whitmore's final homecoming, the story of her life and disappearance continued to ripple outward, like a stone dropped into still water, the effects subtle but far-reaching. Maplewood Hollow was no longer the kind of place where secrets were buried and questions were silenced. It had become a town shaped by a hard lesson and softened by grace. Not just the woman, but the very concept of it. The Grace Whitmore Academy flourished, both in enrollment and reputation, becoming known not only for its charming stone architecture and community gardens, but also for its deeply rooted philosophy. Teach with compassion, listen without judgment, and protect what's quiet before it disappears. Children who had never met Grace grew up learning her name like they learned the alphabet, not as a warning, but as a promise. Inside room 3B, now a reading sanctuary lined with sunlit cushions and watercolor portraits, a plaque hung beneath her smiling photograph. She taught us that love isn't loud, but it lasts. Lydia continued to be part of the school's heart, though she rarely spoke publicly about her sister anymore. It wasn't out of pain, but because she felt her duty had shifted. Grace's story had been told. Now it was time to protect the stories of others, before they ended in silence too. She met with young girls who feared being misunderstood, with teachers struggling behind brave smiles, and with boys who'd grown up learning to hide emotion and were only now unlearning it. She told them, quietly and simply, that being strong didn't mean staying quiet. One such student was a 12-year-old girl named April Dunning, who came to Lydia one morning with tear-streaked cheeks and a crumpled letter in her fist. Her mother had been recently diagnosed with a chronic illness, and April had been hiding her fear under jokes and failing test scores. "I thought if I just didn't say anything, maybe it wouldn't be real," she whispered. Lydia held her hand and said, "That's what my sister thought too, but silence doesn't stop pain. It only lets it grow in the dark." April became one of the first recipients of the Grace Whitmore Scholarship 10 years later. That same year, the dam near Clearwater was partially drained for maintenance, revealing for the first time in decades the jagged edge of the old mining shaft that had once been Grace's grave. Engineers secured it with concrete, but not before allowing a small group, Lydia, Mr. Ellis, Reverend Carter's son, and the town historian, to approach it one last time. Lydia stood there, looking into the shallow shadowed gap between earth and history, and said nothing. She didn't have to. She carried her sister not in words now, but in every action, every child she guided, every life she refused to let fall through the cracks. Later that summer, something unexpected happened. A man from Maryland wrote to the town council. He was 63 years old, and his name was Thomas Whitmore. He had been adopted in late 1972 in upstate New York by a family who told him little about his origins. After reading the story of Grace in a magazine archive, he had taken a DNA test out of curiosity. It matched with the Whitmore family line. The council forwarded the letter to Lydia. Her hands trembled as she read it. Thomas enclosed no demands, no assumptions, just a question. Could I possibly be the son she meant to protect? They met that September in Maplewood, in a quiet corner of the school garden surrounded by sunflowers and marigolds. Lydia saw Grace in the lines around his eyes, in the quiet way he smiled before speaking, in the way he instinctively ran his fingers across the binding of the poetry book she brought to show him. He didn't need proof. Neither did she. "She would have loved you," Lydia said, and Thomas smiled, eyes wet. "I think I've felt that all my life." He was raised well. He had 3 daughters, taught music in a high school for decades, and never knew his birth mother's name until a twist of history and technology brought it back to him. He asked to visit room 3B alone. The staff allowed it. He sat on the window bench where Grace once read stories aloud, and he cried. Not for what was lost, but for what was found just in time. That evening, the two of them walked up the hill overlooking Clearwater, where Grace's body had once rested, and where now only water and sky remained. Thomas stood in silence for a while before pulling something from his coat pocket, a silver locket with a daffodil pressed inside. "I brought this," he said softly, "for her." He let it fall into the water. Lydia didn't speak. The lake shimmered under the pink sky, the ripples spreading gently as if the world itself had just taken a deep breath. That night, back in town, Lydia wrote one last letter. She didn't know why, maybe for herself, maybe for the girl she used to be, maybe for Grace, though she already felt closer to her than ever. "You were never truly gone," it said. "You stayed in every question I asked, in every child I held, in every book I opened, in every moment I chose to speak, when silence would have been easier. You live in the change you left behind. You live in him, and you live in me." She tucked it into her diary, beneath the last poem Grace had written. not as an ending, but as a continuation. Because the truth was, some stories don't end. They echo. It was a Tuesday morning in late October when the Grace Whitmore Academy held its first annual Day of Voice, a quiet but powerful tradition started not by any administrator or school board, but by a group of students who had grown up hearing the story of the teacher whose voice was silenced for too long. They wanted a day where anyone could speak, write, or simply be heard, without fear of ridicule or judgment. The school auditorium was decorated with drawings of sunflowers, stars, and open books, symbols the students associated with Miss Whitmore. There were no bells that day, no standardized tests, no lectures. Instead, children as young as 6 stood before their classmates to share poems, dreams, secrets, fears. A boy talked about missing his dad, another about being afraid of the dark. A girl read a letter she had written to her future self. And when one child choked up, unable to finish his story, the others clapped anyway, not out of pity, but out of respect. Lydia sat in the back row beside Thomas Whitmore, both of them silent as they watched. It was, in many ways, the fulfillment of Grace's last wish, a world where shame didn't win, where truth didn't hide, where children learned early that silence was not strength, but suffocation. That night, Lydia and Thomas walked home through the town square, now lit by golden lamps and lined with warm brick storefronts. Autumn was thick in the air, and maple leaves fluttered down like soft confessions. "Do you think she knows?" Thomas asked, as they passed the marble plaque outside the school bearing Grace's name. Lydia didn't answer immediately. She looked up at the stars, so much like the night Grace had disappeared. "I think," she said softly, "she always knew we would find her. Maybe not in time to save her, but in time to save each other." That evening, while Thomas prepared to head back to Maryland the next morning, Lydia returned alone to room 3B. She hadn't been in the room after dark since before Grace's disappearance, but tonight she needed to feel her. She needed to be near the place where Grace had laughed, taught, hoped. She turned on the small desk lamp by the window, the only light in the room, and sat down at the same table her sister once used. Everything was quiet except for the occasional creak of the old school settling into its foundation and the distant rustle of wind outside. Then, as if summoned by memory, she reached into her bag and pulled out the tin box of Grace's poems. It had taken her months to go through all of them, and even longer to gather the strength to compile them. But she had finally done it. A local press had agreed to publish the collection. Grace Notes, the unheard poems of a lost teacher. The first run would be small, but meaningful. It was more than paper and ink. It was restoration. Lydia opened the manuscript's proof and read her sister's words again. They still felt like whispers from across a long hallway. "I was not loud. I was not bright. But I was burning quietly, beneath the layers they never thought to lift." A tear traced Lydia's cheek, but she didn't wipe it away. She let it fall. It wasn't grief anymore. It was release. The next morning, she walked into town with a copy of the proof in hand and left it at the church, placing it gently on the front pew where Grace had once sat. She left another at the library, another at the diner, and the last one, deliberately with a steady hand, on the doorstep of the now abandoned Benning estate. No note, no explanation, just the truth, bound and titled, resting where silence once reigned. Months later, on the day the book was officially released, a small but heartfelt gathering was held in the town square. It wasn't a book launch, it was a reckoning and a homecoming. Former students spoke, a teacher read aloud. A girl named April, now a senior, performed a song she had written based on Grace's poems. And when Lydia took the stage, she didn't speak as a victim's sister or as a woman scarred by the past. She spoke as someone who had survived it. Grace was a woman who chose to protect instead of punish, who gave up her voice to protect her child, her reputation, even the man who failed her. And for years, I thought that silence was what killed her. But now I see, it wasn't the silence that killed her. It was the people who didn't ask why she was quiet. This book is not just her voice. It's a call to listen before someone disappears. Because every person you pass on the street is carrying something. Sometimes all it takes to save them is to ask if they're okay, and really mean it. When she stepped down, the applause wasn't loud. It was soft, respectful, filled with gratitude, just as Grace would have wanted. That night, Lydia walked once more to the lake above the shaft. She no longer feared the place. It no longer felt like a grave. It felt like a beginning. She sat there for a long while, listening to the sounds of frogs, wind, and her own heartbeat. She closed her eyes, holding nothing in her hands, and said aloud, "We found your light, Grace, and we didn't let it go out." In the quiet that followed, something shifted. Not in the wind, not in the water, but in her. It was peace. After all the years, finally. Peace. Spring turned into summer in Maplewood Hollow, and with it came a gentle warmth that settled across the town like a blanket that had finally stopped shivering. Life continued, gardens bloomed, bicycles creaked along the gravel roads, and laughter once again spilled from schoolyards. But beneath the surface, something had undeniably changed. Grace Whitmore was no longer just the teacher who had disappeared. She had become something larger, a quiet symbol etched into the foundation of the town, like the roots of the trees that lined its winding hills. Her name lived in every morning announcement at the academy, in every sunflower planted at the edge of the library lawn, in the poems children now wrote when they were asked to speak from the heart. But perhaps the most lasting thing she left behind wasn't her memory, it was the permission to feel. One morning, nearly a year after Grace's remains had been found and laid to rest, Lydia received a package at her doorstep. The return address was a bookstore in Washington, D.C., unfamiliar and unassuming. Inside was a manila envelope wrapped carefully in old newspaper clippings, and within it, a single sheet of lined paper with an elegant, unfamiliar handwriting. I think I was supposed to find this. It was signed only S.R. Confused, Lydia reached into the envelope again and found what the note referred to. A small, spiral-bound notebook, frayed at the edges, with the initials G.W. etched faintly on the cover. For a long moment, she just stared. She had thought everything had been found. But clearly this wasn't from the basement of a Vermont school or the depths of a lake. As she opened it, the scent of old ink and time hit her all at once. The first page read simply, Washington, November 1972. The entries that followed were not long, not crafted like the poems Grace had once written. They were short, raw, confessional, and they confirmed something Lydia had always wondered but never dared to believe. Grace had made it out of Maplewood, if only for a few weeks. The notebook recounted bus rides, a cheap rented room near Logan Circle, a woman she met who let her use the name Walker without asking questions, and, most heartbreakingly, a single sentence scribbled across the bottom of a page in shaky, panicked ink. "I feel like someone is following me." The next 2 pages were blank. Then a new entry, several days later, and markedly different. It was shorter, the handwriting more hurried. "I'm going back. I don't know why, maybe to explain, maybe to fix it, but I can't stay away forever. I can't pretend not to care. If anything happens, if I disappear, please don't let them think I wanted this." The last page simply read, "The truth is heavier than silence, but I'd rather carry it than let it crush someone else." Lydia felt the world tilt slightly beneath her feet. Grace had left, and she had come back, maybe to reason with Charles Benning, maybe to retrieve something she left behind, maybe because she still had hope that people could change, and that hope had cost her everything. She closed the notebook slowly, breath shaky, and placed it gently on her dining room table like an offering. Her first instinct was to protect it, to keep it secret. But as she looked out the window at the school across the street, she knew that was no longer her role. Her job was not to guard Grace's pain. It was to make sure the weight of it taught people how to carry their own. A week later, the notebook was added to the school's memorial archive in room 3B. Displayed behind glass beside Grace's poetry and a photograph of her holding a small bouquet of sunflowers on a field trip. Visitors came not to gape at tragedy, but to learn from it. And not just locals, teachers from out of town, counselors, writers, even college students studying the cultural history of small-town America. One professor called Grace's life an unintentional blueprint for how communities erase and then recover women's stories. Lydia didn't need the academic language. To her, it was always simpler than that. Grace had been a girl with a quiet voice, a growing life inside her, and a town that was too afraid to listen. But now they listened, loudly, openly. One late summer evening, as dusk spilled across the streets like watercolor, Lydia sat with Thomas in the backyard of the old Whitmore house, now partially converted into a community center for young women. He had returned to Vermont often in the past year, sometimes with his daughters, sometimes alone, always leaving behind a little more silence than he brought. "I've been thinking," he said, gently swirling the last of his lemonade, "about the idea of legacies. I used to think a legacy was what you built. A business, a family, a reputation, but Grace, she didn't have any of that. No property, no degrees, no heirs." He looked out over the fence at the school where her name now stood in gold lettering. "And yet she changed everything." Lydia smiled. "Maybe legacy isn't what you leave behind. Maybe it's what you keep others from losing." He nodded. "Do you ever talk to her?" "All the time," she said, "especially on days when I want to disappear. I ask her how she did it, how she stayed kind when the world gave her every reason not to." He glanced over. "And what does she say?" Lydia tilted her head and looked up at the first star blinking into view. "She says love isn't what saves you, it's what makes being lost worth surviving." And in the hush that followed, they both heard it. Not words, not sound, but the unmistakable presence of someone who had once been forgotten, and now would never be again. Dot. The following fall brought with it a quiet kind of momentum, not the loud revival of a town reborn, but the steady, gentle heartbeat of a place learning to breathe again. Maplewood Hollow had stopped pretending to be perfect. In its place, it became honest. The town's annual Harvest Festival was held for the first time in 3 years, and though the lights were strung the same way, and the scent of apple cider still drifted through the square, something deeper had shifted. The centerpiece of the festival was no longer the mayor's speech or the raffle draw. It was a candlelit poetry reading in the school courtyard, beneath the oak tree where Grace once sat on her lunch breaks. Children and adults read from Grace's posthumous collection, but they also read their own work. Words they once thought too small to be heard, too fragile to hold meaning. A teenager who had once been suspended for fighting read a poem about his father's silence. An elderly woman, long widowed, read a letter she had never sent. Lydia was the last to read, standing beneath the golden leaves with Thomas beside her, and the wind teasing the edges of the page in her hand. She chose not a poem, but a note, one Grace had written in the margin of a lesson plan, now laminated and framed in the archive. "If no one hears you, write it anyway. The right heart will read it when it's ready." The crowd was silent, not in mourning, but in reverence. After the reading, people lingered, reluctant to leave the warmth that had gathered. That's when Lydia noticed the woman standing by the edge of the courtyard. She was tall, wrapped in a long gray coat, her hair streaked with silver, and her eyes fixed not on the stage, but on room 3B's lit window. Lydia approached gently. The woman turned as if she'd been waiting. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "I don't mean to intrude." "You're not," Lydia replied, offering a small smile. "You knew her, didn't you?" The woman hesitated. "A lifetime ago." "My name is Clarice Pennington. Grace and I, we were in a teacher training program together. She saved me once, not in any grand way, just by sitting next to me when no one else did." And Lydia's chest tightened. Even after all this time, Grace was still revealing herself. Clarice looked up at the window. "I thought she'd become someone huge. Famous, maybe. I looked for her name on bookshelves, in magazines. Then I stopped. Until I saw her face again. In an article someone shared on a grief forum. She reached into her purse and handed Lydia a small envelope. "This is something she gave me. Told me to open it only if I felt like giving up." Lydia opened the envelope later that night. Inside was a single piece of thick, folded paper. In Grace's unmistakable cursive, it read, "Some of us were born to be echoes, not explosions, but even echoes reach mountains." Below it, in smaller writing, "If you're reading this, please don't fade. Someone needs your light, even if you don't know who yet." Lydia held the paper to her chest and wept, not because she was sad, but because Grace was still here. The next week, Clarice returned to speak at the academy. She shared stories of young Grace, her wit, her shyness, the way she doodled stars in the margins of every notebook. The students listened like she was telling a fairy tale, except this one was real, and its hero didn't fly or fight, but simply endured. Over time, visitors started leaving notes by the memorial. Some were signed, some anonymous. All carried the weight of what had once gone unsaid. "I didn't tell my mother I loved her before she died. I'm going to say it every day to my kids now. I haven't written a poem since 8th grade. Today I wrote 5. I thought no one saw me, but she would have." Lydia began collecting these notes. They became a book of their own. To Grace, from us. The proceeds went toward funding counselors in small-town schools. Meanwhile, Thomas worked with a local theater group to adapt Grace's life into a stage production. Not a tragedy, but a story of awakening. It opened the following spring under the stars, using real quotes, real names, and a chorus of students reciting her poems like hymns. At the final curtain, the audience stood not in applause, but in silence. A silence so full, it sang. And still Grace spoke, not through seances or whispers, but in the realest way there is. Through changed lives, spoken truths, and brave, imperfect voices daring to be heard. One evening, as Lydia locked the archive for the night, she paused at the door and looked back. The lights were dimmed, the displays quiet, and yet the room pulsed with something alive. Not grief, not loss, but the sacred weight of story. She whispered, barely audible, "You were never gone, just waiting." And somewhere, across the distance that separates the known from the unknowable, the living from the lost, Grace Whitmore, teacher, sister, survivor, echo, smiled. The anniversary of Grace's disappearance arrived like it always did, in silence. There were no parades, no breaking news segments, no candlelight vigils in the square. Just the sky softening over Maplewood Hollow, a town that had once buried its truth beneath fear and now carried it tenderly, like a photograph in a wallet. Lydia woke early that day, before the light had fully broken across the trees. She stood at her window, coffee cooling in her hand, watching as the fog unfurled slowly over the schoolyard. A robin landed on the fence, another joined it. Small signs of life, unnoticed unless you were still enough to see them. She spent the morning walking. First past the library, where Grace's book now sat between Whitman and Angelou, then by the church where the organist still played the same hymns Grace once hummed under her breath. At last, she arrived at the cemetery, where Grace's grave rested under a willow that had grown taller in the past year. There were flowers. Not just Lydia's, but others. Sunflowers, daisies, even a child's drawing sealed in a Ziploc bag. She knelt and whispered, "I kept my promise." It wasn't a dramatic moment. No thunder cracking in the distance. No sudden gust of symbolic wind. Just the quiet assurance that something had been mended in the invisible fabric of the world. That afternoon, the school bell rang at exactly 3:12 p.m., the same time it had rung the day Grace never came back. No one had planned it. No one said a word. But for those who knew, it felt like a bow being tied at the end of a long, painful chapter. Room 3B remained untouched that day. Students walked by it a little slower. Teachers paused longer at its threshold. One girl, Maya, who had once been caught forging permission slips to escape her mother's anger, left a tiny notebook on the desk. Inside were her own poems. The first one read, "You don't know me, but you saved me anyway, so I wrote this, so you wouldn't be alone." In the months that followed, the Grace Whitmore Foundation launched its first national campaign, offering grants to support under-resourced teachers across rural America. Lydia oversaw the program personally, traveling to towns that felt eerily similar to hers, meeting women who were fighting their own quiet battles in classrooms filled with children too tired to dream. She told Grace's story not as folklore, but as a cautionary tale. What happens when we dismiss silence as compliance, when we ignore the weight of a woman's eyes? She always ended with a single question. "Who have you not listened to lately?" One teacher cried, another hugged her wordlessly. A third sent her a letter months later, saying she had found the courage to speak out about her own assault because of Grace. The ripples continued. A university literature department hosted a symposium titled "The Power of the Unheard." A songwriter from Nashville released an album inspired by Grace's poetry. And every September, Room 3B filled not just with flowers or tears, but with children writing the kind of truths that once lived only in the margins. Thomas retired the following year and moved closer to Maplewood Hollow. He and Lydia met every Sunday for coffee and silence, the good kind. Not absence, but understanding. They talked about Grace less often now, not because she had faded, but because she had become a part of the background music in their lives, like a familiar song that no longer needed to be sung to be heard. One evening, as fall began its slow descent again, Lydia returned to the lake. This time, she brought nothing with her. No letters, no questions, no pain. Just herself. She sat at the edge, toes barely grazing the surface, and stared into the reflection of the trees, gold and trembling. "I'm okay now," she said. The words surprised her, not because they were untrue, but because they felt so calm, so final. A soft breeze rustled the reeds, and she could have sworn, for just a moment, that she felt a hand on her shoulder. Not heavy, not pulling, just resting. The wind shifted, the air exhaled, and Lydia stood, brushed off her skirt, and walked back into a world where her sister no longer needed to be found, because she had already been heard. The last bell of the day rang across Maplewood Hollow, not as an ending, but as an answer dot. Sometimes, the loudest voices are the ones never heard. Grace Whitmore didn't leave behind headlines or scandal. She left behind a silence that shaped an entire town. But silence, as we've learned, can be broken. Through a sister's love, a community's reckoning, and words once hidden in the dark, her story finally found the light. If you've ever felt unheard, unseen, or forgotten, let this story remind you. The truth has a way of rising. Even if it takes decades, even if it starts with a whisper. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Nest Soul, where lost voices find a home and every mystery has its meaning. Because some stories aren't just meant to be told, they're meant to awaken.